Hello, humans. My name is Thunder, and I has thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts about today's topic. You see, the Texas Senate recently passed SB 1515, a bill that would require all Texas public schools to display a poster of the Ten Commandments in every classroom. The bill is currently under consideration in the Texas House of Representatives and was brought before the Committee on Public Education on May 2nd for a public hearing. If you're thinking to yourself, wait, isn't there a constitutional amendment about this? You're absolutely right. It's the very first one. The discussion of this bill is illustrative of the small steps the Christian right has been taking for decades to break down the rights and protections enjoyed by all Americans under the Constitution and to rebuild this country as a white Christian Protestant nation. This hearing took place just before 9 a.m. and was adjourned until other House business was completed. It resumed after 8:30 p.m. that evening and continued for quite some time after. Anyone who had registered to testify who didn't make it in before the 9 a.m. adjournment was forced to wait around in the Capitol building for 11 and a half hours until the committee reconvened, several members short after a long day. The bill is sponsored in the Texas House by Representative Candy Noble, a three-term Republican from Texas's 89th District, a relatively wealthy district just northeast of Plano. First, we'll hear from Representative Noble introducing her bill to the committee.
Chair lays out Senate Bill 1515 and recognizes Representative Noble to explain the bill.
Thank you, Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to lay out Senate Bill 1515. The Ten Commandments are foundational to our American education system and to our American judicial system. Our earliest school textbooks and our earliest laws include and reflect this fundamental way to respect and treat others and their property. Religious liberty was the bedrock of American founding, and until 1971 Supreme Court decision in Lemon versus Kurtzman, America regularly acknowledged the role that fundamental religious documents and principles had in American heritage and law. The Ten Commandments were and are displayed in public buildings across the United States, including in schools, government buildings, and courthouses, including the U.S. Supreme Court building. The problem is that for the last several decades, expression of that historical heritage has been restricted. One of the largest upheavals was in 1980 in Stone versus Graham, in which the Supreme Court used the Lemon test to strike down Kentucky's law requiring the Ten Commandments to be displayed in public schools. Prior to Stone versus Graham, many public schools displayed the Ten Commandments, and after Stone versus Graham, however, public schools across the country almost universally removed their Ten Commandment displays. Now, however, the legal landscape has changed. The Kennedy versus Bremerton School District in 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Lemon, eliminating that Lemon test, and instead looking to America's history and tradition for whether the government may recognize our religious heritage. In 2005, our Ten Commandments monument displayed here on our Capitol grounds, even using the Lemon test, was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. You may note that the wording in this bill replicates the wording on that monument that is on our Capitol grounds. Senate Bill 1515 would require Texas public elementary and secondary schools to display the Ten Commandments in each classroom. This legislation will bring back this historic tradition of recognizing America's foundational heritage in both our education and our judicial system. Senate Bill 1515 restores those liberties that were lost and reminds students all across Texas of the importance of fundamental foundation of American law and Texas law, the Ten Commandments. I do have some invited witnesses here today who are experts in their field who can answer the more technical questions, and I am happy to answer any questions and reserve the right to close.
Throughout this discussion, you'll hear many references to three specific Supreme Court cases. These are Lemon versus Kurtzman, Stone versus Graham, and Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. Let's go through these three cases briefly so we have a foundation for understanding the arguments made by Representative Noble and the bill's other supporters. Lemon versus Kurtzman was a case brought in 1971 by taxpayers in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island against similar legislation in both states that would allow some public funding to go to non-public, non-secular schools. Both laws were struck down on the grounds that they violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." In Lemon, the court held that a bill must pass a three-pronged test, the Lemon test, to avoid violating the Establishment Clause. The three prongs are: the statute must have a secular legislative purpose, its principal or primary effect must be one that neither promotes nor inhibits religion, and it must not foster excessive government entanglement with religion. Stone v. Graham was a 1980 case challenging a Kentucky state law that required the posting of a copy of the Ten Commandments in each public school classroom. That sounds familiar. The Supreme Court ruled that the Kentucky law violated the first part of the Lemon test, finding that the law had no secular legislative purpose and was plainly religious in nature, noting that the Ten Commandments specifically mention the worship of God and observance of the Sabbath day. Finally, Kennedy v. Bremerton School District is a 2022 case involving a high school football coach, Joseph Kennedy, who engaged in prayer with students during and after school football games. The district asked him to stop to protect the school from a lawsuit based on the Establishment Clause. Kennedy refused and then sued the school district under the First Amendment and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that Kennedy was disciplined for personally exercising his religious rights, violating his First Amendment right to free speech and free exercise of religion. They held that Kennedy did not offer his prayers while acting within the scope of his duties as a coach. Importantly, the court abandoned the Lemon test and replaced it with a consideration of historical practices and understandings. Supporters of the Texas bill cite this abandonment of the Lemon test as evidence that with the change in the balance of the Supreme Court, this bill would be ruled constitutional despite the precedents of Lemon v. Kurtzman and Stone v. Graham. So, back to Texas. Representative James Tallarico, a Democrat from District 50 in Austin, raises some questions immediately. He first acknowledges the importance of the Ten Commandments to many people in the room, including himself and his faith. He mentions that some of the commandments can be hard to follow. He brings up the commandment to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and then observes that the committee is scheduled to meet on Saturday. Representative Noble acknowledges that, yes, it is a hard commandment to follow. He mentions, "Thou shalt not kill," and questions whether the legislature has made any effort to eliminate the death penalty. Representative Noble contends that the commandment refers specifically to murder, not to justice or war. Tallarico reminds her that the particular translation she is advocating says kill, not murder. She reiterates several times that they are using this translation because it is one that has already been upheld by the Supreme Court in a previous case regarding this display of the Ten Commandments at the Capitol building. Representative Tallarico then challenges her interpretation of the recent Kennedy decision. He questions whether there's a difference between the coach being allowed to pray because it's his own personal faith, as opposed to this bill, which requires all teachers to post the Ten Commandments in their classrooms. Representative Noble rather feebly repeats her assertion that this is historical and foundational.
I contend that the historic and foundational reference of the Ten Commandments in our nation's history is what we're looking at here, and not the bunny path that I think you've taken us on. I am not an attorney, and I do not play one on TV, but I do have an attorney here that can speak to that better than I can, and so I would like to defer to let them answer that, if that's okay with you.
I confess I don't usually watch state legislative proceedings, and so I don't know how common it is for a person proposing a bill to have absolutely no idea about the constitutionality of or precedents supporting their bill, nor the greater implications. But Noble's responses strike me as particularly weak and bordering on defensive. You'll see later that her defensiveness in her answers to Representative Tallarico and others becomes progressively more pronounced. Even just a few minutes into the back and forth, we start to get the impression that she's simply a mouthpiece. She has no answers beyond what's on the paper in front of her. Tallarico then proposes some amendments or alternatives, for example, the 5 Precepts of Taoism, the Code of Hammurabi, or the Magna Carta, instead of the Ten Commandments. Noble's response is simply, "That is not my bill." He presses her on this, asking if she would allow religious texts from Hinduism or Buddhism, for example. She doubles down on the historical foundations of the American education system, that the Ten Commandments and other Bible verses were found in our earliest textbooks. So let's talk about that. The first school textbook published in the United States, or what would become the United States, was the New England Primer, first printed in the 1690s for students in Puritan schools in what would become Massachusetts. This was almost a century before the United States, and thus the Constitution and its First Amendment, existed. There was no unified system of public education, and the Puritan schools were explicitly religious. It's no surprise that their school books would contain many biblical references and verses, including the Ten Commandments. Until the 1830s, schools were generally private, locally managed efforts. Though the founders of the United States knew that free, standardized education was vital to the growth of a healthy nation, the idea of free public schools did not take hold until the mid-19th century. It wasn't until the 1870s that public schools as a system had become somewhat standard. But still, only about 78% of children aged 5 to 14 were enrolled in public schools by then. High school didn't even really become a thing until the 20th century. As for textbooks specifically, from the 1790s to 1836, Noah Webster's Speller was the most common textbook in schools. Yes, that Noah Webster of Webster's Dictionary fame. His Speller was later supplanted by the McGuffey Readers. Webster's Speller contained no mention of God, the Bible, or religion. The McGuffey Readers remained popular for decades, introducing a graduated method of teaching reading, beginning with the alphabet and simple vowel sounds and phonetics, and progressing to longer and more complex stories. There is no mention of God in the initial reader. I've linked to a Project Gutenberg ebook version in the description below. I recommend taking a look. It's actually quite charming. Representative Noble's insistence that the Ten Commandments were in textbooks and are foundational to the history of public education in America is demonstrably false. She may not even know herself that she is repeating Christian nationalist lies. But she certainly knows she has no actual defense or support for her position. Representative Tallarico then points out the hypocrisy of relegating the teaching of empathy and sex ed to parents, but now asserting that it is the state's role to teach religious values. A full 5 seconds of awkward silence ensues before Noble manages to stutter out a response that simply repeats the words historical and foundational and offers no new insights or support, nor does she actually engage with Tallarico's question. She then adds that she thinks having the Ten Commandments posted would help with classroom management. Representative Tallarico then challenges her on a religious level, citing their shared faith as Christians, suggesting that because the bill is idolatrous and exclusionary, it violates the number one teaching of Jesus, which is to love your neighbor. He, somewhat ironically, quotes the Bible from the dais, noting that faith is meant to be practiced privately, not publicly declared, and that faith without works is dead. He wonders why they are spending time on a bill requiring a poster instead of one that will feed the hungry and clothe the naked. Noble again refuses to engage, instead asserting that this bill rights the wrong done by the Stone v. Graham case. Representative Noble's first invited witness, Timothy Barton, on behalf of wall builders, has 2 main arguments. 1, the bill is constitutional because of the Kennedy decision. And 2, one of the popular history textbooks in the early years of the country was Noah Webster's History of the United States, which contains the Ten Commandments, which he claims demonstrates the historical tradition of the Ten Commandments in classrooms. I found a copy of this textbook on Google Books and will link it in the description. What the witness fails to mention is that the entire book leans heavily on the white Christian Protestant narrative of superiority and civilization. It begins with the Genesis account of creation, continues through Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel, and uses that as a segue into describing 6 different races of the world. It is extremely racist and speculates wildly about cultures other than white Christian Europeans. It is no wonder that the white Christian nationalists of the 21st century so enjoy this textbook. It feeds their fantasy of this nation being founded by and for white Christian Protestants. It's also very anti-Catholic. The final chapter of the book is entitled Advice to the Young, and essentially goes through each of the Ten Commandments and interprets them as a way of imparting wisdom. This chapter is not part of the history itself, but more of an epilogue. The version of the textbook I found was published in 1832. As noted, public schools weren't really a thing in the early 19th century. Not to mention that 1832 was more than 2 decades before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. Geology and paleontology as fields were in their infancy, and the creation narrative from the Bible was still the major explanation of how the world came to be among Christians and Jews. This was before the Civil War, before even the abolition of the slave trade in Great Britain and France. The Revolutionary War was still a living memory for many. That's how different the world, and especially the United States, was back then. That doesn't excuse the inaccuracies and racist language used in the book, but it does serve to explain why a history textbook would start off with stories from the Bible. While this textbook was popular and widely used, schools then were mostly local, community-based, often privately funded affairs, as I mentioned. This was not the state imposing standards. There were no educational standards back then. Here's another interesting take from this witness.
As well, the moral component of this is becoming vitally important. We are seeing a world and society around us in decay, and we are seeing more and more issues in schools where there is violent crime. We're seeing more and more young people involved in shootings and murders, and there's a level of irony, a sad irony, when we would send people to jail for stealing and for killing, and yet we're saying that students should not be able to see the very things they would go to jail for, the foundation of morals in Western society. It would certainly make sense, as we are seeing a moral decay, and if we want the best for our students, we would show them the historic traditional moral standard upon which all Western civilization was birthed and born, and something that arguably, if we had more people following the Ten Commandments, we would solve so many of the issues we are seeing today. It was not long ago. We saw a shooter go into a Christian school in Nashville, and this shooter shot up the Christian school. If more students were learning things like don't kill other people, the world would be a far better place if they had, again, this basic moral standard. What I want to encourage is the two easy evidences we can point to: long-lasting historic tradition in education. And I've brought only a few samples. I can go through numerous examples. This is part of the historic tradition of America, but also it's the basis of morals. And I think we would all agree we want our students to grow up with a moral compass. And the Ten Commandments has been the historic tradition of morals of Western civilization.
According to Mr. Barton, the reason for school shootings and the decay of society is that people don't know they shouldn't steal and kill, and somehow having a poster on the wall of a classroom will solve this problem. You know what else might solve some of these problems? Social emotional education, teaching empathy and social justice, gun control laws, support for the unhoused and economically disadvantaged, support for mental health care, inclusion, equity, and compassion. Also, I'm pretty sure students are taught that killing and stealing are, wrong. To sum up this man's entire argument, 10 Commandments good because moral compass. Don't worry, the Supreme Court will allow it. Historic tradition of America. Dude, that's not an argument. Mr. Barton is followed by a witness representing the Liberty Institute, which is the organization that represented Coach Kennedy in the Kennedy versus Bremerton case. His entire argument is, yeah, it's constitutional because we got them to overturn Lemon. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. The last witness to speak before the committee adjourned is Carissa Lopez on behalf of the Texas Freedom Network, the first member of the public after the two invited witnesses, and the first member of the public to testify against the bill. Since she only was given 2 minutes to speak, I think it's worth playing the whole clip.
Good morning, committee members. Thank you so much for having me and getting me in nice and early. My name is Carissa Lopez. I'm the political director of the Texas Freedom Network, an organization of parents, clergy, young people, and other Texans who support public education and religious freedom. TFN strongly opposes SB 1515. As Texas children walk through their school doors, they have the opportunity to better their lives and future. And when they walk through those doors, they don't leave behind their beliefs, thoughts, or ideals. In requiring Texas public schools to display the 10 Commandments in every classroom, this bill is forcing Christianity into classrooms and alienating multitudes of children of other faith and no faith in the process. Religious freedom is a fundamental value in Texas and across the United States that commands that we have the right to practice the faith of our choice or none at all, free of government interference or involvement. When one faith is used to guide public policy, that endangers religious freedom for all of us. As we see it, SB 1515 is not about religious freedom, but about control. Families should be the one who get to direct religious education of their children, not government mandates that require specific language in our classroom. I urge you to take back religious freedom for all Texans by voting no on SB 1515. Thank you.
As you can see, Ms. Lopez takes a similar tack to Representative Tallarico, arguing that the bill forces Christianity on all students and excludes those who practice other faiths or none at all. As I play a few more clips of witness testimony, pay attention to the differences in the arguments for and against the bill. At this point, the committee adjourned until the evening. A little after 8:30 p.m., the hearing resumed. After wrapping up some other business the committee had left pending that morning, they returned to the hearing on SB 1515. The first witness to speak upon resuming this discussion was YouTuber and activist Aaron Ra. It was his video about this issue that brought it to my attention, and I'll link that two-part video in the description below. In it, he speaks with First Amendment lawyer Andrew Seidel about the broader implications of the bill and how it fits into the Christian right's overall method of chipping away at First Amendment protections. Let's see what Aaron had to say.
Chair calls Aaron Raw. Aaron Raw, okay.
It's Aaron.
Aaron, okay. We show you registered as Aaron Raw on behalf of yourself, and you'll be testifying against the bill. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, you may begin.
Religious extremists don't believe in plurality or inclusion, but only in their own superiority and privilege. So in the 1950s, they changed our national motto from the unifying phrase e pluribus unum to an exclusionary proclamation of religious belief, and then forced atheist children to chant that mantra ever since. They don't want a democratic republic of we the people. They want an authoritarian regime of forced conformity, restricting even our most intimate liberties, what we think and even who we are. To achieve that goal, they promote American exceptionalism, which is the lie that the U.S. is blessed and will remain so only as long as we appease the Christian version of God, even when that means attacking unbelievers and queer folk, which our increasingly awful state is already doing. In order to sell the first lie, they need to couch it in another lie, that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation, which is demonstrably factually false even according to the founders themselves, and the lie that our laws were based on Moses, who experts now say never existed. The First Amendment contradicts the First Commandment because the founders wanted to be the polar opposite of the Sharia-like law of Moses. But if the 10 Commandments were prominently displayed in every classroom, then the kids would believe that lie. That's why religious conservatives want this. They are relentlessly trying to rewrite history to undermine our pioneer example of a secular nation, the only form of governance that can provide religious freedom. And our model has become the envy of the Western world and is now emulated by older countries that were once the oppressive theocracies that our forefathers escaped and that Christian nationalists now want to drag us back to. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said this bill would promote religious freedom, which of course it won't. It will have the opposite effect, which is the intended effect, to promote Christianity to a privileged position. This bill is an unconstitutional establishment of religion by design. That is the whole point of it, and the only possible purpose behind it, so it must not pass.
Aaron articulates the essential point, that the bill is a prop by Christian nationalists to further their goal of turning the United States into an oppressive theocracy. Notice that the bill's supporters haven't managed to give a reason why they want this. They've insisted that the 10 Commandments are foundational to our educational and judicial history, and that it's totally constitutional, trust me. But those aren't reasons why. The only argument in favor so far that can remotely be called a reason is moral compass, and something about how reminding the students that God doesn't want them to kill people will prevent school shootings. However, as we've already seen, opponents of the bill have a multitude of arguments against the bill, citing everything from the First Amendment itself to the hypocrisy of the bill to the exclusion it perpetuates. What it really boils down to is that there is no good reason to require the 10 Commandments to be posted on the walls of public school classrooms. An argument could be made for allowing it, although I'd still be against doing so, as would most or all of the others we've heard from. But there may be a time and a place where a poster like that may be pertinent, such as Representative Tallarico suggested, alongside, say, the 5 tenets of Taoism, the 5 pillars of Islam, the 7 fundamental tenets of the Satanic Temple, the Magna Carta, or the Bill of Rights. The next witness is a Mr. Chuck Cruz, who takes the opportunity to point out the dismal state of Texas public education and reminds the committee that Texas leads the nation among larger states in high school dropout rates, teen pregnancy, and school shootings. But it's this part of Mr. Cruz's testimony I want you to hear for yourself.
So let us discuss SB 1515. This bill specifies the size of the proposed posting, the text, and the visibility, but does not currently specify the material of construction. As a retired chemical engineer, I can assure you the material of construction is a crucial specification. If you are so intent in violating the U.S. Constitution you swore to defend, I suggest you at least amend this bill to specify the 10 Commandment posters be made of Kevlar, so that perhaps the proposed poster might someday actually be of use to Texas school children.
Mr. Cruz's disgust comes through loud and clear. Though his statements were not direct arguments against the bill, he certainly drove home his point. The next witness is a psychiatrist who again points out the exclusionary nature of the first few commandments. Then a Jewish man who demonstrates the difference between the original Hebrew version of the Ten Commandments and the version the bill proposes. He also shows that the Christian version is actually divided up and numbered differently. He is followed by a young Christian man in a delightful rainbow polo shirt who argues from a position of freedom of expression on a personal level and says, "It's not evangelism, it's indoctrination." He also mentions that pushing religion on people like this turns them off, but more than that, it hurts people. Then comes a woman named Mary Elizabeth Castle on behalf of Texas Values, who testifies in favor of the bill. Along with the same arguments we've already heard, she says this.
Having these 10 commandments in the classroom should not be a controversial issue. Having them just shows that these are a foundation for our principal laws, that students understand that we gain a lot of what we understand from society from these 10 basic principles. And whether or not a child is a Christian or not, they can find some truth in these 10 principles, and they're there just to represent an educational purpose.
It shouldn't be controversial? Well, the fact that there are literal hours of arguments about this bill should demonstrate to you that it is, in fact, controversial, and maybe you need to take a little quiet time to figure out why. After Ms. Castle is Joshua Houston from Texas Impact, an interfaith organization representing Texas Protestants, Muslims, and Jews. He testifies against the bill on the grounds that it favors one religion over another, favors Christians and Jews over Muslims, and even chooses winners and losers from among Christians and Jews. He explains.
That's because even among the Judeo-Christian members, there is no agreement on what exactly the 10 Commandments are. As you heard from Mr. Colbert, we asked our clergy, and they told us the same thing, that Jews, Lutherans, and Protestants not only translate the text differently, but they also number and divide them differently. So, for instance, many Jews would say, "I am the Lord your God" is the first commandment, not preamble. Many would find omitting text from the Bible, as this bill does, abhorrent, because remembering God's liberation from slavery is essential to that first commandment. The bottom line is that there is no way to write the 10 Commandments in a way that doesn't pick winners and losers between faith traditions.
He's absolutely right. Whenever someone says the 10 Commandments, an interesting response could be, which version? Indeed, there are even two versions in the Old Testament itself. Once in Exodus chapter 20, and again in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Even between those two versions, there are slight differences. For example, the fifth commandment, according to the way it's numbered by Jewish people, says, "Remember the Sabbath day" in Exodus, and "keep the Sabbath day" in Deuteronomy. There are at least 3 versions of the 10 Commandments and hundreds of translations. The version in the Texas bill comes from the King James Bible, and they read as follows. "I am the Lord thy God. Number 1, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Number 2, thou shalt not make to thyself any graven images. Number 3, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Number 5, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Number 6, thou shalt not kill. Number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. Number 8, thou shalt not steal. Number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And number 10, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his cattle, nor anything that is thy neighbor's." I'd like to take a moment to point out that the language on this poster would be extremely archaic. Most elementary school students would not understand it, and I would be very interested to be in the classroom the day one of the students asks the teacher what adultery is. The Jewish version looks like this. First commandment, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." Number 2, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a graven image, nor any manner of likeness of anything that is in heaven above, that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto the 1000th generation of them that love me and keep my commandments." Imagine how scary that would be for a child to read on this classroom wall. Number 3, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that takes his name in vain." Number 4, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath unto the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any manner of work, you, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your cattle, and your stranger that is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day, wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. I could imagine a cheeky fifth grader telling his teacher that the poster on the wall says they shouldn't work on the Sabbath and therefore there shouldn't be any homework over the weekend. Number 5, honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. Number 6, you shall not murder. Number 7, you shall not commit adultery. Number 8, you shall not steal. Number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And number 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Note that in the Jewish version, I am the Lord thy God is the first commandment, while the second combines, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make yourself a graven image, etc. While the Protestant version uses I am the Lord thy God as a preamble, and then splits what is the second commandment in Judaism into first and second. The Catholic version, which is also used by the Lutheran Church, is also different. Very different. In fact, it's not even a direct quote from the scriptures, it's a summary. They number them as follows. Number 1, I am the Lord your God, you shall have not strange gods before me. Number 2, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Number 3, remember to keep holy the Lord's day. Number 4, honor your father and mother. Number 5, you shall not kill. Number 6, you shall not commit adultery. Number 7, you shall not steal. Number 8, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Number 9, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And number 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. So the Catholics return I am the Lord your God into the first commandment, but combine that with the commandment against idolatry. This serves to completely renumber the remaining commandments, so that the commandment against coveting must be split into separate commandments to make it back up to 10. So even the argument that the 10 Commandments honors the Judeo-Christian traditions upon which our country was founded, which isn't true, but we'll grant them that for the sake of discussion, is a bad one, because there is no single Judeo-Christian version of the Bible, nor of the 10 Commandments. A Mr. Connor Rice testifies next against the bill. He's an undergraduate planning to become a history teacher in Texas. He made a beautiful statement from the point of view of his own Methodist faith. Listen to this clip.
Let us strive to create a society that is inclusive, diverse, and respectful of all beliefs and backgrounds. The 10 Commandments has a place in my home and my heart, but not in my classroom. And I pray that all of you decide in opposition to this bill, because no legislation can mandate God's plan for this state.
I think he said it perfectly, and I have nothing to add. Another witness testified briefly against the bill, and quite a few people were called but were not present. The late hour meant that several people who probably had good things to say did not have the opportunity to say them. And then came Ms. Molly Carnes, an active Christian who is not against the 10 Commandments by any means, but again points out that posting a Christian document in a public school classroom does not contribute to learning and excludes students who are not Christian. She then says this.
But bottom line, public schools are not religious institutions. This is an obvious violation of the Establishment Clause because it promotes a particular religion in a public institution built and operated by public funds. And it looks just like Christian nationalism. I mean, if it quacks like a duck. You know, and I know conservatives have whipped up the base to believe that students are being indoctrinated to do all sorts of impure things. But the 10 Commandments are not an insurance policy against your child being queer or sexually active or a Democrat.
I'm just going to say it. I think I love her. She's the only one since Aaron Ra who has pointed out the Christian nationalist angle, and it's vitally important to say this again and again. This is absolutely part of a plan by Christian nationalists to turn this country into an oppressive theocracy. They support a bill like this, it gets challenged, goes up to the Supreme Court, and because they've managed to stack the court with heavily right-leaning activist justices, they'll get all of the precedents overturned, giving them free rein to pursue the next step in their crusade against the freedoms we are supposed to be guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. A Dr. David Albert, professor of political science at a local community college and a Jewish person, makes many of the same arguments as previous speakers against the bill, including its unconstitutionality and the varying translations and versions. He even quips that the problem with going so late is that everyone has stolen his material. Jennifer Bates, a seminary student studying to be a member of the clergy, testifies eloquently against the bill, saying in part,
"What good is a sign going to do? Is it going to remind them that they are less important to their teachers because they are not Christian? Is it going to remind them the state does not hold what they believe is important? SB 1515 is making the 10 Commandments into an idol, an image that takes us from the true view of God. Forcing the 10 Commandments as a decoration for classrooms are actually breaking the 10 Commandments, that you shall have no other gods before me, you shall have no graven images, and you shall not take the Lord's name in vain." In supporting the bill, the legislature has replaced the golden calf with the Ten Commandments and have ignored the demands of the God that these Ten Commandments claim to be from. The commands to love our neighbor, to care for the sick and the foreigner among us. Instead, these are empty words on a sign, bowing to the God of Christian nationalism. The commandments mean nothing when teachers are forced to put them in the classrooms. It is a farce that will not make our nation Christian, but will make our state a bastion of failed community care. Will not only make the students Christian or better, but it sees Christianity as a religion of a failed state, grasping at whatever means it has to control the people the state has.
Who better than an aspiring clergy person, someone whose Christian faith is so strong that she was driven to become a minister herself, to testify against a Christian symbol in the public arena? Representative Tallarico was clearly very moved by her testimony and asked her what she feels the ramifications of the bill will be in terms of the rising number of non-believers and atheists among younger people. She states that it will turn people away because
I think what we'll see is a lot of people who will see religion as no longer something that is about their love of God, but a reminder of who has the right to say who they are and what they can do.
She's absolutely right. When religion is forced upon someone, they are more likely to turn their backs on it. When a state forces a religion on its citizens, it creates backlash. One need only look at what's happening in Iran right now to see what happens when a religious regime oppresses too many people for too long. Ms. Bates is the final witness, and the floor is returned to Representative Noble to close. Representative Tallarico takes the opportunity to continue challenging Representative Noble on her bill. Here's some clips of that.
But the foundation of our country is the Constitution of the United States. Would you agree?
I did not. I said that it was foundational to our education and our educational system and to our judicial system.
Would you agree the foundation of our country is our Constitution?
I would agree that the Constitution is very, very, very important to me and to all Americans.
You won't say whether it's the foundation of our
country. Well, I don't know where you're going with this, so I'm not going to be boxed in by wherever you're going with it.
Well,
I'll just be honest with you.
Well, that's okay. We both swore an oath of office when we joined this legislature. Did you swear to uphold the Ten Commandments in that oath?
I did not.
What did you swear to uphold?
I contend that my relationship with the Lord is foundational to who I am as both a Christian and as a legislator. So I don't know why you're kind of splitting hairs there, but I absolutely love our Constitution and do uphold it.
And so in the oath of office that you took, you sort of uphold
Yes, I did.
the Constitution?
Yes, I did.
Do you believe schools are for education and not indoctrination?
Absolutely.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out is why is having a rainbow in a classroom considered indoctrination and not having the Ten Commandments in a classroom?
Is that a question?
Yes.
I am not arguing another poster. I'm arguing that the Ten Commandments are represented in our earliest education system and our earliest education books, all for many, many, many years, and also reflected in our foundation of our laws in this nation. And that's why I think it's important and like a bedrock of where we came from as a nation to share with our students.
Well, I think the foundation of our laws is the Constitution, but we'll move on. How do you think it makes a Hindu student feel to have a poster in every classroom that says, "Thou shalt not worship any god before me"?
Again, I'm not going to try and get into the heads of someone else. I am talking about what is foundational to our nation, what's important to us. And honestly, the fundamental respect and how to treat others and their property is universal. And I'm interested in why you're trying to divide us instead of unite us on this theme.
And so it's not a trick question. I'm just asking you to try to understand how this will make a Hindu student feel, how this will make a Buddhist student feel, how this would make an atheist student feel. Just asking for basic empathy. So how do you, so
I don't know how, I think you want me to answer in a way that I'm confused on what you want me to say.
I'm not trying to confuse you.
I'm hoping that when they see that, they will look at it and wonder about our founding fathers and what made them tick. And I think that any historical document should make our students curious about what went before us.
We can see Representative Noble becoming increasingly defensive, behaving as if she's on the witness stand being questioned by opposing counsel, believing she is being led into some kind of trap. What trap? The trap of saying, you know what? You're right, this bill sucks. She has no answers for him. She falls back on foundational and historic, and that's not my bill. And she comes very, very close to admitting that the real purpose is to convert everyone to Christianity. She hopes it will make the children curious about our history? No, she hopes it will make the children curious about Christianity, that they'll go home and ask their parents what it means, so that their parents will challenge the law, take it to the Supreme Court, and lose. That's what she hopes. Representative Gina Hinojosa takes over with a few questions of her own. She's a Democrat and neighbor of Representative Tallarico, representing District 49 in Austin. She asks a simple question.
Representative Noble, you've mentioned several times that the Ten Commandments are foundational or a basis for our laws. Can you give some examples?
Well, I think it's obvious when that's the central part of our Supreme Court building that those that went before us and those that designed those buildings understood that the law that was given to us in the Bible is foundational to how to respect others and how to treat others and to respect their property. And I love that is the foundation of our judicial system.
Noble cannot give a specific example and instead goes right back to her script. Hinojosa presses her on it. Can you guess what Representative Noble says?
But I wanted to go back to examples of how the Ten Commandments are foundational to our laws, and I didn't quite understand what you said about the Supreme Court.
I wish you would have asked an earlier today an attorney that testified. I just am so grateful that our founding fathers understood that if we don't respect authority and respect others' properties, that we are sunk as a nation, and I love that about what went for us judicially.
So, and I'm not trying to, I don't know what examples there are. Do you have any examples about?
I don't have them in my book.
You don't have?
I will, you know what, I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Though. I would love to.
I'm wondering, though, whether if you don't see a school where we teach children putting up the Ten Commandments as establishing a religion, indoctrinating kids, then do you acknowledge that is a prohibition in our Constitution? And if so, what does that even look like from your perspective? What would be in violation of that if this isn't?
I really don't have the answer for you right now on that because I feel like I'm being trapped, and I know that that's not your heart, and so I really want to give you a good answer. Can I circle back around to you on that one as well?
You can, and
we're
I'm
all
not
pretty tired at this point.
I know, and I'm not trying to trap you. I'm just trying to understand. There's a difference. Different sides here about how we view the Establishment Clause, and I'm trying to understand.
Well, what's really interesting is that for more than 100 years of our government, nobody had a problem with this, and all of a sudden, in the last 50 or 60 years, there's been this very different turn of what that means, and so historically, this is on my side, and it's only, and I know we're younger, so a lot of us don't remember having this in our classrooms, but I do. And I don't think we're better off for not having it in our classrooms.
I don't know how you can support a bill like this and come so very unprepared to answer predictable questions. She just keeps falling back on the bullet points her backers gave her. Her own opinion on this isn't based on any introspection, research, or knowledge. She even admits at one point that she thinks the Ten Commandments teaching us to obey authority is important. She's a good Christian, doing as she's told by, presumably, people like the Liberty Institute, who are clearly promoting a Christian nationalist agenda. Representative Matt Schaefer, a Republican from Texas's 6th District, which is southeast of Dallas, steps in to throw Representative Noble a bone.
Thank you, Representative Noble. I'm going to read something to you. You tell me whether you agree with this statement, okay? The Establishment Clause does not require, indeed it nowhere mentions, the separation of church and state. This phrase is a distortion of a comment made by Thomas Jefferson. Instead, the Establishment Clause prohibits the establishment of a state church, and the Supreme Court has instructed that instead of the Lemon Test's concern with endorsement of or entanglement with religion, courts should look to America's history and tradition in determining whether an action comports with the Establishment Clause. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that.
And would you agree that under the history and tradition test, 10 Commandments displays are constitutional because they fit within the tradition of publicly recognizing the role of religion in our nation's history?
I do agree with that.
This is the argument Noble should have come armed with. It's not a good argument by any means, but at least it's an attempt. As for his assertion about the origin of the phrase separation of church and state, he is correct that Thomas Jefferson used the phrase, but he used it in the context of the Establishment Clause. Jefferson explained his understanding of the First Amendment's religion clause as reflecting the view of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall between church and state. In other words, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and the third president of the United States, said straight out that that's what the First Amendment is meant to do. It creates a wall of separation between church and state. That's essentially the end of that part of the committee meeting. They do not vote on it, but they leave the bill pending, then move on to other business. It's clear from this discussion that the main arguments in favor of this bill are that it will somehow inspire Texas students to be more moral and to think about the place of God and religion in the history of our country. The assurances of its constitutionality are irrelevant. Slavery was constitutional until it wasn't. Segregation was constitutional until it wasn't. But we can see from recent decisions by the current court, with its 6-3 right-leaning majority, that it has no problem overturning decades-old precedents to further the Christian nationalist agenda. If this bill passes, and it looks likely to do so, although as of this recording the full House has not yet voted, I am absolutely certain it will be challenged and go all the way to the Supreme Court, where its supporters might just be right about how the court will rule. And when it does, that will open up many more avenues for this minority group to shove their version of Christianity down the throats of all Americans, whatever their faith, until we look around and realize that they have achieved their goal of creating an authoritarian theocracy. Thank you so much for watching this. I appreciate your prolonged attention. This is such an important issue, and I really wanted to make sure that it got out there, because a lot of times we don't know what's going on in other states or even in our own state. And this is scarier than it looks on its surface. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave them in the comments below. Check out the links in the description as well. I have a lot of links to a lot of sources there. If you like this kind of content and would like to see more, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time when I have more thoughts to share. In the meantime, have a bath and a nap, and take care of yourselves.